This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to look at Black Enchantments. In one of last week's MTG Top 10s, I looked at Red Enchantments, and right now, one Top 10 each week is on enchantments in a given color, so that's why we're looking at Black today. Like Red, Black isn't normally a color that's super into enchantments, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some powerful ones. While this list isn't quite as stacked as the red one last week was, there are some crazy powerful cards on the list. To be eligible for it, a card had to be a mono black enchantment. In all, there are 533 black enchantments, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's take a look at the top 10 black enchantments, starting with the number 10 card, which is Arabicos, God of the Dead. This enchantment creature is a Theros god. For 3 generic and a black, he's a massive 5/7 with indestructible, but if your devotion to black is less than 5, he's not a creature. And to get your devotion to 5, you have to have permanents in play with 5 or more black mana symbols in their casting costs. Whether he's a creature or not, the next 2 lines of text always matter. He shuts off your opponent's life gain, and you can pay 1 generic and a black and 2 life to draw a card. Paying life to draw a card is a quintessentially black effect, and this won't be the only enchantment on the list that lets you do it. While there were lots of devotion decks in Theros Standard, black was arguably the most powerful of the bunch, thanks to cards like Erebos and Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which hugely incentivized you to play cards with lots of black mana symbols. Erebos was also played in some less devotion-centric control decks while it was in Standard, usually as a sideboard option to bring in during grindier matchups. More recently, Erebos has found success in Pioneer, appearing in sideboards, where it's one of the most effective ways to shut down Amalia Life combo decks. The continued presence of those decks in Pioneer probably means Erebos is going to gain more points in the future. At number 9, it's the Cruelty of Gris. For 3 generic and 2 black, this enchantment is a saga. That means it has separate chapters that trigger at different times. Chapter 1 lets you look at your opponent's hand and make them discard a creature or planeswalker. Chapter 2 tutors up any card and puts it into your hand and you lose 3 life. And Chapter 3 reanimates a creature from any graveyard. In other words, this saga has a trio of very black effects: discarding, tutoring, and reanimation. Typically, when a saga enters the battlefield, you put an age counter on it, and it gains another age counter after your draw step each turn, and you get the chapter with the same numerical value as the total age counters. That would mean you would start with the discard effect on Chapter 1, and you don't have much say in the matter. However, the Cruelty of Gris has read ahead, which means you can start on whatever chapter you want. This is nice because sometimes you really need to get one of the later chapters right away. For example, if you're really far behind, you probably don't have the luxury of waiting to get to Chapter 3, since Chapter 1 and 2 don't impact the board and Chapter 3 does. If you have time to get all 3 chapters of value, it nets you an impressive 3-for-1, and you can even tutor up another Cruelty with Chapter 2 and start the whole thing over again. Cruelty has gained most of its points in Standard, where it tends to be one of the strongest cards in mid-range and control decks. These decks can often use Chapter 3 to bring something back like Atraxa or Itali, and getting those huge creatures that grant you tons of card advantage into play early is pretty insane. The Cruelty of Gris is going to keep seeing play in Standard going forward, and it's not impossible for it to find more success in Pioneer either. At number 8, it's Deadweight. This one's pretty simple, and you probably didn't think it would show up on a list of the best black enchantments. For 1 black mana, it's an aura with enchant creature, and the enchanted creature gets -2/-2. This means it can kill 2 toughness things outright, which feels pretty good for 1 mana, and it can significantly weaken other creatures too. You'd probably only expect a card like this to see play in rotating formats like Standard, right? I mean, it's basically a sorcery speed shock, right? Well, it is true that it has gained the most points in Standard formats, and partly as a result of multiple reprints, but it's also found some pretty serious success in Historic, Pioneer, Legacy, and even Vintage. In all the formats where it's seen play, it does so either because of the fact that it's an enchantment, or because it's a removal spell that's easy to recur from the graveyard. For example, in Standard it was played in Delirium decks, which wanted lots of card types in the graveyard, and Deadweight was an enchantment that usually ended up there when it killed something. And in Pioneer, it's played in SRAM decks, which are all about cramming as many enchantments into your deck as possible, so you draw lots of cards. In Legacy and Vintage, it's played in Lurrus decks, which can cast Deadweight from the graveyard repeatedly. That's not something you can do with most removal spells. So, the seemingly unimpressive Deadweight is actually kind of a powerhouse in the right deck, even in the Eternal formats, and it's going to keep gaining points as a result. At number 7, it's Underworld Connections. For 1 generic and 2 black, this enchantment is an aura with enchant land, and you can tap that land and pay 1 life to draw a card. Paying life to draw cards is quintessentially black, and there are many enchantments that do it. 3 mana for a repeatable source of additional cards is pretty powerful, and it's the kind of thing that can just win you the game by attrition over your opponent. Most games, the extra cards you get will let you kill your opponent quickly enough that you don't really care about paying life. That made it a great card for Jund decks while it was in Standard. Like Arabicos, it saw a lot of play in Black Devotion decks too, where the 2 black mana in the casting cost brought all kinds of additional value, and it could be played alongside the aforementioned Grey Merchant, making it less dangerous to draw cards with the connection. It was a heavily played card in Standard, with all of its points coming from that format alone, so in the long run it's probably not going to hold on to a spot on this list. At number 6, it's Animate Dead. Like Cruelty of Gris, it's a black enchantment that reanimates a creature. Mechanically, this might just be the weirdest enchantment ever printed. The original text of the card is kind of a nightmare, but when they tried to modernize it to work within the game's rules today, they didn't do much better. For 1 generic and a black, it's an aura with enchant creature card in graveyard, but when it enters the battlefield, it actually loses enchant creature card in graveyard and gains enchant creature card put into the battlefield with Animate Dead, and you return the enchanted creature from the graveyard to the battlefield under your control and attach Animate Dead to it. If Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, you sack the creature. The enchanted creature also gets -1/-0. So to sum up, it's a 2 mana enchantment that reanimates a creature card from your graveyard and puts it into play under your control, but it has 1 less power, and if you ever lose this enchantment, you lose the creature too. This is one of the most efficient reanimation spells in the entire game, as losing 1 power in most creatures that are worth reanimating doesn't really matter. It first saw play at Magic's very first competitive event, the 1994 World Championship. It first made an appearance in dedicated Reanimator decks in Extended in 2001, where it was bringing back Avatar of Woe and Verdant Force, 2 creatures who could very easily take over games between their huge bodies and powerful abilities. Not long after that, it transitioned into Legacy Reanimator, where it's consistently seen play for the better part of the last 2 decades. In years past, it's been bringing back Elesh Norn and Terastodon. These days, it's usually reanimating Atraxa and Archon of Cruelty. Animate Dead's going to keep gaining points going forward, especially in Legacy. At number 5, it's Bitter Blossom. For 1 generic and a black, it's a tribal enchantment with the fairy type. The tribal and fairy part means that it qualifies as a fairy in all zones for payoffs of that creature type. It'll also be triggering your other fairy payoffs because of its effect. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a life and make a 1/1 black fairy rogue creature token with flying. For the low investment of 2 mana, you quickly assemble a fairy rogue army, and it's well worth paying some life to get there because it very quickly gives you a massive advantage, one that just snowballs. This card was actually preemptively banned in Modern and was banned for the first 3 years of the format because it was considered too powerful. It's particularly powerful against control decks, since neither spot removal nor board sweepers can completely remove this threat. While it was featured in fairy decks in Block Standard, Modern, and Extended, it's also good enough to see play in other black decks as a win condition. This has included diverse Modern decks, including Jund, Junk, Tokens, Affinity, and Vengevine, and Legacy decks like Bug Leovold and Blue-Black Death's Shadow. However, it last gained points in 2022, and Animate Dead is going to pass it in the very near future. At number 4, it's Bridge from Below. Animate Dead is pretty unique mechanically, but so is Bridge from Below. It's another enchantment that's very into the graveyard. It costs 3 black mana, but it's effectively a completely blank card when it's in play. Instead, Bridge from Below only does stuff if it's in your graveyard. This effectively means you get the effect for free, and that's something that's always incredibly strong, especially because the effect is really powerful. Once it's in your graveyard, you get to generate a 2/2 black zombie creature token whenever a non-token creature is put into your graveyard from the battlefield. It does have a downside though. Whenever a creature is put into an opponent's graveyard from the battlefield, you exile the bridge. So, Bridge from Below really thrives in graveyard decks, especially those that also have a bunch of sacrifice effects and can make use of those extra bodies. It first started to see play in Extended Icarid decks, which rapidly loaded the graveyard using Dredge and other effects, So, getting the bridge in the graveyard and reanimating multiple Icarids a turn was really easy, because Icarid sacrifices itself at the end of every turn. If you have the bridge in your graveyard, that means you get a 2/2 token every time. It's also seen a ton of play in multiple formats alongside Gravecrawler, who happens to combine really well with the bridge, because if you sacrifice Gravecrawler and get a zombie, that means you can cast Gravecrawler from your graveyard. It later rose to further prominence in Modern thanks to Hogak. Hogak both wants cards in your graveyard and bodies on the battlefield, and the bridge is happy to be in the graveyard generating bodies, and it really allows you to get Hogak into play in the extreme early game using both Delve and Convoke. Ultimately, the bridge got banned in Modern for making graveyard decks too good, making it our second consecutive Black Enchantment that got banned in Modern. However, it has long seen play in Legacy and Vintage Dredge, and that's going to continue to happen. The cards in front of it are fairly active too, but the bridge has a chance at one day occupying a higher spot on the list. At number 3, it's the Meathook Massacre. For X and 2 black, this black legendary enchantment gives each creature -X until end of turn when it enters the battlefield, and whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and whenever an opponent's creature dies, you gain 1 life. Having an enchantment as a sweeper is pretty sweet because you not only gain life and lower your opponent's life the turn this comes down, the enchantment sticks around and continues to deliver sweet value. This also means that this is a sweeper that both pressures your opponent's life total and makes it harder for you to die. Basically, if someone resolves one of these, they're probably going to win, or at the very least, they aren't going to be dying anytime soon. The Meathook Massacre dominated Standard during the time it was legal there, making black control decks way too good, so it eventually got banned out of the format, making it our 3rd consecutive black enchantment to get banned in at least one format. It's also found success in Pioneer, where its power level is more acceptable, and it has a single point in Legacy, but it doesn't look like it's secured a consistent home for itself in the format. Still, the Meathook Massacre is likely to continue to gain points in Pioneer, but the 2 cards in front of it are still seeing tons of play, and since its time in Standard, Meathook Massacre has definitely slowed down, so number 3 may be the best it can do, and Bridge from Below might even pass it. At number 2, it's Necropotence, probably the most famous, or infamous, black enchantment ever printed. For 3 black mana, it forces you to skip your draw step, and whenever you discard a card, you exile it from your graveyard. Those downsides are nothing, though, on a card with Necropotence's activated ability. You can pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library face down, then you put that card into your hand at the beginning of the next end step. So, there is a delay, but basically, Necropotence can draw you as many cards as you have life, all for only 3 mana. Necropotence is a card that was famously underrated when it came out, as people just couldn't imagine the downsides on the card would be worth it. People quickly realized they were wrong once they started playing with Necropotence, since the card advantage it gave black decks made them virtually unbeatable. This resulted in the summer of 1996 being called Black Summer because everyone was playing black to gain access to Necro. The dominance of Necropotence didn't end that summer though. In fact, the card was even more out of control by 2000 and 2001, so it was banned in Legacy and Extended and restricted in Vintage, and it remains banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage today. Necropotence has actually enjoyed a renaissance since 2020, as Doomsday decks have become top tier in Vintage. These decks generally try to win the game with Thassa's Oracle and Doomsday, and Necropotence can help you out by helping you find Doomsday, and you can also put the Necropotence in your top 5 with Doomsday to get to your Oracle even sooner. By the way, if you want a deeper dive on Necropotence decks, I have covered them in my deck history series. So yeah, Necropotence is going to keep on helping Doomsday decks do their thing, but it's unlikely to ever pass the number 1 card on the list, which has a massive lead, and that card is Layline of the Void. For 2 generic and 2 black, this enchantment makes any card that would be put into your opponent's graveyard from anywhere get exiled instead, and like all Laylines, you can stick it right on the battlefield for free if it's in your opening hand. Layline of the Void is one of the best ways to hate on graveyard shenanigans, as it covers all the bases while not being symmetrical. Your opponent can't load their graveyard in any way, shape, or form. Whether they try to mill or discard or sacrifice creatures, none of it works. Combine that with the fact that you can have this in play before your opponent ever has a turn, and we're talking about an amazing hate piece. This has led to it seeing tons of sideboard play in most of the formats it's ever been legal in. In addition to hating on graveyard decks in all of Magic's 60-card formats, it's also a combo enabler in Legacy and Vintage. If you have the Layline in play and you activate Helm of Obedience, you exile your opponent's entire library. This is because of how the Helm works. It constantly checks to see if X cards or a creature card have been put into the graveyard. Because the Layline stopped cards from ever going into the graveyard, the Helm's condition for stopping the mill never occurs, so the whole library gets exiled. Between being one of the best graveyard hate pieces in the game and a powerful combo enabler, Layline of the Void is going to continue to gain a ton of points, and it's hard to imagine any Black Enchantment ever overtaking it. So those are the top 10 Black Enchantments. Do you want to use your enchantments to draw lots of cards, pull off some graveyard shenanigans, reanimate, or kill creatures? If you do, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that it gets some more views. If you want to catch up on past videos, including the one that looked at red enchantments last week, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.